If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this.
Skeptics of UFOs, have you ever encountered terrifying alien beings, such as tall grays or interdimensional entities? Have you seen UFOs, experienced abductions, or lost time? Share the story that changed your beliefs.
Well, this story is a little odd. I think I was about 10 to 11 years old when it happened. Now I'm 16 and can't think of an answer to that isn't an alien. At that age, I used to go to church with my sister and come back 8:09 p.m. The church was very close to my house. It was on the street facing the street where I lived, and I could see it from the front door. Me, my older sister, and 3 of our friends who were also sisters went back together. They lived in front of a football field, and next to this field there was a small path whose entrance was a big tree. The girls' house was right at the end of that path, but they could also get there by crossing the field. When we arrived in front of the path, we stopped to talk a little. The street was lit and some neighbors and guys in a bar were a little close to where we were, so no problem. Suddenly, the youngest of the sisters says that she saw something move in the bush under the tree, and her older sister throws a pebble to see what it was. The moving thing appeared, just the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. I'd say it was literally the standard description of an alien, with the exception that the skin was a pale, yellowish white. Big black eyes, a big head, the mouth and nose were practically striped, and he breathed heavily. It is also worth noting that he was crouched in a way that we only saw his face among the bushes. We were terrified and screamed. The creature also looked scared and looked like it wanted to get out of there. He looked around scared and was restless. When we tried to approach him, he just jumped out of the bush and was very, very, very fast. We could barely see his body, skinny and as white as his head. I swear he was so fast that we lost him easily. The girls didn't want to go through the path and cross the field. My sister and I went back to our house. It was on the same street as the one in the field, really close, and we were even stopped by neighbors asking what had happened, but we didn't answer. When we got home, we told our mother, who was the only one awake, and to our surprise, she believed and even went there to see if the thing was still there. Obviously it wasn't. I don't care if someone doesn't want to believe it. I know what I saw, and I wanted to share it because I find this story very interesting. Camping with some friends in the Smokies. I woke up in the night sometime with lights flashing everywhere, scared shitless. Next thing I know, it's morning, and my alarm is going off. Everyone was completely fatigued, and a couple of the girls were crying and demanding we leave. So we packed up camp and took off. I wish I could accurately describe the atmosphere that morning. It was so surreal. A 4-day camping trip lasted about 12 hours. Mike had a small 1-room cabin on the property, so we set our tents around that and got settled in. We then proceeded to get trash. My GF at the time was pounding beers, so I took it easy because I knew I would have to look after her. We had a blast. I had stopped drinking because my GF was blitzed, but I continued to smoke some weed until around 1 a.m. I had put my GF to bed in the tent a few hours earlier. I started to get tired, so I went off to my tent, and my cousin went to his cabin. A couple of guys were still up, but I never found out when they went to bed. Sometime between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m., I woke up or dreamt that I woke up with bright lights flashing from every direction. My tent was red, and I remember thinking it was the cops at first, but I quickly realized, 1. No sound. 2. We were in the middle of nowhere on private property, not even a road. I remember that I was freaked the duck out. Like heart pounding, unable to scream, shit, I still think about 20 years later, kind of scared. I remember I was sitting up, my shirt was off, and I remember the lights were kind of diffused. Not like a flashlight beam but more like spotlights from every direction, some moving fast, some slow. Most seemed to be coming from above me. Next thing I know, my watch is beeping. I vividly remember thinking, holy shit. That was one incredible dream. I've kept a dream journal since I was a teenager. My GF was still snoring, so I decided to go out and get the fire stoked and maybe start breakfast. When I opened the tent, the one dude, GF, was already awake, sitting in her chair and bawling her eyes out. I asked her what was wrong, and she said, I want to go. The next hour was extremely weird. The girl that my cousin was interested in came out of her tent and just broke down but never said a word. The other guys finally woke up and came out but never said a word. I was getting ready to cook when the girls started demanding to go home. My cousin was still asleep in the cabin, so I woke him up. He was then and still is oblivious to anything strange happening that night or that morning. My dad was really young when this happened. Maybe 5 or 6, if I recall correctly. This all happened during the night. I don't know what time this started and what time it ended, but my dad was outside with my great-grandpa, and with them were these really tall white beings. I don't know to call them angels or aliens or what. Now, my great-grandpa was a pretty big dude. Standing at about 6'2", he was a bit muscular. He only came up to the shoulder of one of these beings, and that being was one of the shorter ones there. One of the beings took my dad with it, he guesses a ship, and they measured him. The length of his arms and his legs, I think they measured his head as well. I know at the very least they were checking his head out for some reason or another. Now, the ship, or whatever it was all white. It was bright inside, and there were no shadows anywhere. I want to say they also probed my dad's knees, but I'm not sure. He's got weird scars on one of his knees. He doesn't even remember walking to the ship, he just remembers standing there with my grandpa and these beings. The next thing he knew, he was in the ship and had no clue how he got there. My grandma, my dad and my great-grandpa all saw this. The weird thing about it though is that my grandma saw these beings as people. Like you and me. Think of a doctor or a scientist in a white lab coat. That's what she saw, I think, people in lab coats, but she didn't see what my dad or my great-grandpa saw. About 2 more of these tall white beings were also doing something with the well that my great-grandparents owned on their land, but my dad doesn't know what. At some point, my great-grandpa told my dad to not talk about what happened and what he saw that night. Roughly 10 years later, when my dad was around 15 or 16, he asked my great-grandpa about that night, but he wouldn't talk about it. And then years later my great-grandpa died not long after I was born, so getting his side of the story will sadly never happen. And many years after all of this, come to find out, my dad has something wrong with his brain. Remember when I mentioned they were checking my dad's head out? I don't know everything that's wrong with my dad's brain, but one doctor told him it's like he has 2 brains. My dad has an underdeveloped corpus callosum and Missy also found out he has 2 kneecaps in each knee, so that could have been why they checked out his legs. My dad always wondered why these tall white beings examined him like they did, but after he found out he had all this stuff wrong with his brain, it started to make more sense to him. I've had a mild interest in the paranormal, ufology, and weirdness for a while but never really experienced anything and more viewed it as a form of entertainment. However, something really ducking weird happened last night, and I'm kind of reeling back at how real this experience felt. So yesterday was completely normal Saturday night, really, no different from my usual. Was watching random shite on TV, had some takeout, and a bit later I decided to go up to my room and get my blanket so I could be a bit more comfy on the couch downstairs. Anyway, I walk upstairs, open my door, switch on my light, and then I notice something out the corner of my eye near my curtains. It felt as if something had magnetically snapped my head towards whatever this was, and peeking out from my curtains was an honest-to-ducking god gray. Like the classic depiction of a gray, but it was really small, about 2 feet tall, standing on my windowsill just staring directly at me. I completely froze on the spot, and it took me a second to actually understand what the hell was happening, but all of a sudden there's this rushing feeling, like my stomach had dropped through the floor or something. I stared at it for about 2 seconds, then all of a sudden it ducked behind my curtains, and I saw them swinging as if something had disturbed them. No windows open, no draft in my room, absolutely nothing. Anyway, I felt as if my mind had melted, and I couldn't process what the hell just happened. I stood these just stunned for a while, not sure if it was 1 minute or 10 or 30, then I just bucked it downstairs. My dogs had been asleep previously when I went up there, and when I went in the living room, they were both panting and cowering in the corner as if something had really spooked them. It took them about an hour to settle down. After that, I decided I was going to stay downstairs the rest of the night and didn't fall asleep until the sun came up at 6 a.m. What really strikes me about this is how off the entire thing felt, as if I had seen something I wasn't supposed to have seen. I'm a relatively skeptical person, and I'm not sure if what I saw was a hallucination or not, but I find it very odd how freaked out my pets were and that my curtains were swinging after whatever this was disappeared. I can't stress enough how much this has shaken me. It felt wrong, the entire thing just felt wrong. I'm feeling a bit better this afternoon, and I'm trying to reason with myself. I just had a freaking realistic hallucination, some sort of break in reality, but I just can't stop thinking about it. If anybody can offer any support, I'd appreciate it. I wasn't ready to see that thing, and I feel as if my very idea of what's real and what isn't has been brought into question. Once, my now ex-wife and I witnessed something unusual. It was early morning, around 2:30 or so. We both wake up out of a deep sleep at the same time and look towards the bedroom door. Standing, possibly floating, was a tall, well over 6, built, broad at shoulders and thick through, humanoid-shaped area that you couldn't quite focus on, like the Predator from that movie. It appeared to be facing us on the bed, then turned and glided out of the room. We both turned to the other and said, "Did you see that?" At the same time. There was no fear. I got up and walked into the hallway and then through the house, and nothing was there. I was more confused than anything else. Our son was asleep in the other room and saw or heard nothing. This never occurred again to any of us. I always said there wasn't a feeling of paranormal, it felt like tech. I don't know if it was aliens or people in advanced camouflage or what, but this is the most unexplained event in my life. Now, a friend from college had a similar event. Both he and his girlfriend woke from a dead sleep at the same time, but they were screaming. Both were looking at the door, but they saw nothing there at all and don't remember why they were afraid immediately after they woke. He did the same thing I did, went through the apartment and found nothing there, not fearful after that point but confused. This happened 3 to 4 years ago, and I've been thinking about it recently. It was late one night, around 11:30 p.m., and I'm driving home from my job at Sonic. I was taking US 64 home, which is a fairly desolate stretch of road with houses and farmland on either side. I was in my '99 Ford Explorer, and I was just driving along around 65 to 70 miles per hour with the radio on a low volume. As I'm driving, through my windshield comes a bright green ray of light that envelopes the interior of my vehicle. This lasts for about 2 to 3 seconds, then disappears without a trace. After it happened, I just sped up and got home as quickly as possible. I was only about 5 minutes away. That's about all there is to it, but I was young and freaked out. I've pondered and pondered but have no clue what it could have been. I wasn't tired because I woke up around 5 or 6 that day, and I have no history of illnesses that could have caused it, and I was on no medications. I've told a few people, and they don't think I'm lying. I've never been the kind to lie about that kind of stuff, but no one can give me a solid answer. Some have said, maybe it was a laser, but I don't think there's any way a laser could completely cover my vehicle in green light like that. There was also a farm I was passing by and no street lights. Has anyone had any similar experiences, or can anyone offer any insight as to what happened? It would be much appreciated and would ease my mind. This happened to my dad in southern Missouri in the late 50s. He lived in an extremely rural, wooded area, miles from the nearest neighbor. He was the youngest out of his brothers and sisters, and they were a couple of miles from the house coming back from swimming or something, and there were only a few bikes amongst them to share, so basically they all jumped on the bikes and pegs, laughing at him, and took off, leaving him alone as dusk was coming on. He wasn't particularly scared or nervous, he said, since he had been raised in the country and there were really no major predators to be too concerned about. Well, as he was walking along in a clearing-like area, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. He looked over and saw a figure in a white robe type thing, as he describes it, gliding along the edge of the clearing not too far from him. So basically he said at that moment his body just froze up and he just stood there, unable to move. At that moment the being turned in a floating movement towards him, and he said he had a feeling that the being was surprised that it had been seen. He always says he thinks it was a spirit or angel, but the description fits what I've always heard of as the Greys. He said it had big black eyes and a small mouth and no hair that he could see, and he doesn't remember feet sticking out. He said he didn't recall seeing a mouth move, but he felt the being say, "Don't be afraid, I won't hurt you," in his mind. They stared at each other for a few seconds, and he said he just felt a calm come over him at that moment. Well, he stood there frozen as the being slowly turned in a floating movement and glided into the woods. He finally found his legs and took off screaming and crying up the road after his siblings. So that's the first part of the odd things that happened there. I do believe my dad, as I've asked him over and over for years, and the story never changes, and he swears it's true. The next odd thing that happened to that family is backed up by everyone in his family. One night they were all sitting down to dinner, and all of a sudden in the house they see all these lights coming through the windows. Keep in mind this is rural Missouri in a wooded area in the 1950s and early 60s, possibly when this occurred. So my grandfather grabs his gun, and he and my oldest uncle run outside, and of course all the kids and grandma run to the windows. So they are out there, and these bright lights are just shining down on them from an object right above the tree line in the clearing where the house is. So they are pretty much staring at it in shock, and all of a sudden it's just gone lights and everything like it was never there in a split second. So you tell me what it is? I've always believed maybe a few aliens were dropped there to study our animal and plant life in a pretty much untouched area with few people around to avoid detection, and that night the ships were picking them up. Maybe the other aliens wanted to see a real human, so they did a drive-by, who knows? I know that these stories are true, and I know they would have told me as an adult if they were pulling my leg. These stories never changed amongst all the times I asked to hear them and the different aunts and uncles I asked. I want to share a story, though it may sound insane. I would have considered myself crazy as well if I had witnessed these things alone. It was the summer of 2004, or perhaps 2005, in Olympic, a touristic village near Mount Olympus in northern Greece. I was on vacation with my mom and dad, along with another family, a boy and his parents. His parents were friends with mine, and we were staying in the same apartment. It was supposed to be a normal vacation like any other. However, during our late evening walks along the beach, from Olympic towards Paralia, another touristic town along a walking path, we witnessed many UFOs in different shapes flying over Mount Olympus and sometimes landing in the sea. And when I say many, I truly mean it. There were sightings almost every day. Sometimes there was only one UFO in the sky, and other times there were multiple. They were in different shapes and forms. Some were typical flying saucers, while others changed color and form, moving in a strange zigzag fashion before disappearing in the sky or below the surface of the sea. What I couldn't understand was the calmness and disinterest of the local people, who acted as if everything were normal. There were some French astronomers observing these phenomena with their telescopes on the beach. Years have gone by, and I still have nightmares. I am sometimes scared at night because of the things I saw and couldn't explain to this very day. I'm not some kind of lunatic writing this for attention. I am a well-educated person, and I'm well aware of how this may sound. Probably, if I had not seen this myself, I wouldn't have believed it. I'm interested to know if anyone else has witnessed similar events in this part of Greece. It's especially strange for me because Olympic is a famous touristic village, and lots of people visit it, yet I couldn't find any similar accounts. Was this alien, or something else? I was around 10 to 11 years old. Meaning this happened about 2010 or 2011, not sure of the exact year, but it wasn't that long ago. But even in 50 years, I'll never forget this. It didn't feel like it lasted forever, but more like around 30 seconds. But that small 30 seconds was enough to completely change how I live my life and see this world. We were on our way to Georgia. I have lived in Alabama my whole life, but because Georgia is just a state away, we used to vacation there a lot. Where we lived, we didn't have to take an interstate to our destination, just a really long, almost trafficless road. I wasn't that much into paranormal or alien stuff, but I wasn't a non-believer or even skeptic. I just didn't much care for it. My dad was driving us. Mom is in the passenger seat, and my little brother is beside me in the back seat. I love nature and magical views, so I always love getting near mountains or open fields and just looking out the window at as much as possible till the car passes. We came to this point on the road, where there were a bunch of power sources such as lines, poles, and towers. But a gorgeous mountain behind them all in an open field. Of course, this was my time to take a look at the world. I noticed something in the sky, barely moving. I saw 6 grayish-black circles. Could have been saucers, could have been holes in the sky, I couldn't tell. But there were 6 of them, 3 on each side, in a triangle formation, just like when birds migrate. My dad has studied aliens and government his whole life, and to this day he still talks about Project Blue Book or Project Blue Beam. I forgot the exact name. But as you can tell, he knows his alien stuff. So as I saw those things in the sky, I got a little scared as I was still a kid, and I tried to shake him to get his attention. Here is where it got me the most. As I tried to shake him, I looked at him and realized the car wasn't moving. They were all still there and awake, but it was as if they were all frozen. I will never in my life forget that moment. Everything around me was frozen, and it was only for about 30 seconds. I quickly looked back into the sky, and the things were gone. And everything around me was normal again except that nothing ever started back up. It was as if nothing frozen in the first place. It was almost like time was lost, but it didn't feel like time was lost. That's just the only way I can describe how it ended. Ever since then, I have dedicated half of my life to the unknown world. I love it now, and now I am 19 years old. I'm so lucky to have found a girlfriend who not only believes me but who loves this kind of stuff too. I've been scared my whole life to share that story with anyone up until about 2 years ago. I'm hoping someone can one day not necessarily give me an explanation, but to have had somewhat of the same kind of experience I had. Back in August of 2023, we were staying at an Airbnb in Hatch, Utah. This place didn't have any air conditioning considering the elevation of Hatch, and the temperature was pretty comfortable. This will be relevant later. On the first night, my wife and I were out stargazing since the sky was devoid of light pollution and clouds. I had my GoPro set up and my phone taking photos, and we were just staring up, enjoying the stars. That's when my wife pointed out to me what appeared to be a single small satellite floating across the sky. As we were looking at it, however, it multiplied into 3 lights in a triangle shape. It continued to expand in the same manner until there were about 7 lights in a larger triangle pattern. That in and of itself is pretty weird, But what really was just bizarre was the sky that was visible within that triangle shape more or less froze like a screenshot, and then that section of sky was moving with the triangle while the rest of the sky around it was stationary. The best way I can think to describe it would be like in the movie Predator and his active camo, invisibility tech. The world behind him was visible but skewed. This triangle passed over the sky for a few short minutes until it just seemed to either rise rapidly and disappear or shrink rapidly. It was about that time that we noticed that it had gone eerily silent outside with us. No crickets or anything, even the wind seemed to stop. We decided to go in for the night after that, as we were both pretty weirded out. In awe but weirded out. I got some good pictures of the night sky, but of course, as is usual, they didn't see anything weird. A few hours later, the same evening, when we were getting ready for bed, I wanted to try a long exposure setting I had found on my GoPro, so I was standing on the porch taking pictures. That is when I heard the whistle. Now I am not an overly superstitious man, but I've heard stories, and not wanting to take my chances, I didn't return the whistle. There was a second whistle shortly after the first that expedited my decision to go back inside. Weird out, we laughed it off, locked the doors, and went to bed. Mind you that due to the lack of air conditioning in this house, the windows were all open for airflow. An hour or so later, after we were asleep, my wife woke me up to ask if I heard that. It was at this point that we both heard very clearly a deep growl and breathing like that of a bear or large animal outside our window on the porch. Not loud, but bassy. We could hear heavy footsteps on the porch as well. We woke our friends up and turned all the lights on to look around. There were no footprints on the dusty porch and none in the soft mud around the porch, so this experience we just cannot explain. Of course our friends were asleep in their room and didn't hear a thing, and they didn't experience the earlier sighting outside either. Nothing else weird happened while we stayed there for the rest of the trip. The final thing to have happened, and this is the part that really weirded my wife out, was that a month or so later when we were back home. We were in the kitchen making dinner when she looked up, and there was an owl sitting on the fence just staring into the house at us. I wasn't at the time aware of the correlation between alien sightings or abductions and the sighting of owls, but I am now. To our knowledge, we didn't have any lost time events or anything like that, but it just kind of felt like we saw something we weren't supposed to see, and they were checking us out to see if we were cool. For my wife, this all is a little too much, and it has made her uneasy to stare at the stars as much anymore. I, on the other hand, am still very intrigued. We haven't noticed any more owls as of late, so who knows if it was a coincidence or not. I'm sharing this because I can describe my experience but cannot explain it. I would be interested in hearing if anyone else has experienced anything like this. I was in the forest near my house with my now ex-girlfriend. We were making out on a bench when we began to see very bright torches flash down pathways, and we heard the noise of metal banging against metal. I know this forest inside and out, so I know where metal things are. They must have been 500 yards away, but the sound was unmistakable. We immediately darted towards my house. The light tracked our steps as we charged home. It slipped through trees to catch us, and every path we looked down, the light would stare right back. I'm convinced we were minutes away from being surrounded. We sprinted the mile home, and the torches caught us the whole way. It's fair to say I don't go to that forest at night anymore. It could have been harmless, but it scared the living shit out of me. I do a lot of late walks, so I see plenty of creepy ass shit. Most are probably harmless misunderstandings but creepy nonetheless. Just wanted to share my encounter with a small, dark figure I encountered when I was younger. Plus, looking for suggestions as to what I saw that night. So, this took place on Halloween night, 2006. I was 14 at the time and spending the night at my friend Heather's house along with 2 other friends. We were all going to spend the evening trick or treating in Heather's neighborhood. Heather had 3 siblings there as well, including her brother Eli. Eli was the annoying younger brother who had a crush on me, and any time we would have sleepovers there, he would go into my things and steal my bras and underwear, whatever he could get his weird hands into. This is relevant to the story, I promise. Heather, Eli, and another sister all had their bedrooms in the basement. Eli and the other sister's rooms were at the end of a hallway past Heather's room, which was midway down the hall to the right. Everyone got into their Halloween costumes and makeup and started to gather in the front yard of the house. I'm outside and realize I forgot my trick or treat bag. I got ready in the sister's room, so I ran back into the house to go grab it. I rushed downstairs down the hall and past Heather's room. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone sitting on the middle edge of Heather's bed staring down at the floor. The lights were off, but the hallway light was on. Even though the room was dark, I could easily see the silhouette of someone quite small with an extra large head for their body, just sitting there staring down. I didn't think much about it in the moment, I immediately figured it was Eli sitting there going through my things, as he always did. He was also wearing a costume with a large round mask. Maybe he looked so much smaller because he was sitting at a weird angle, or is it a trick of the eye? It looked odd, but it couldn't have been anyone else. I also thought it strange and quickly took note of how unusually black and solid the figure was, absolutely zero features of any kind to be seen. It made me mad, but I was also too shy and non-confident to call him out on it myself, so I grabbed my bag from the sister's room and rushed past Heather's room again. I was going to rat on him to his parents, so I made sure to look out the corner of my eye again to make sure he was in there as I go past to see the figure still sitting there, looking down at the floor. I get outside and immediately start going off at Heather, telling her that Eli was in her room right now, going through my bag. I was super mad. But she looked confused. She goes, you were the only one in the house. Everyone is outside waiting for you. And points to her brother standing by the road with his group of friends. I felt super uneasy learning that. And she was right. Everyone had been outside waiting for me. There was no way it could have been him inside. He would have had to run past me out the same door. And I know I saw someone or something sitting on her bed. Heather and her siblings were always scared of being downstairs, especially by themselves, and had mentioned that they thought it might be haunted or something weird going on. Especially since their parents had started renovating the house, they noticed a lot more activity around that time. So I'm curious, for those who made it to the end of my story, what do you think this small, large-headed, pitch black, featureless thing was? I grew up in central British Columbia, Canada, where our First Nations people have stories of little people. My initial feeling has always been an alien entity of some sort. Anyway, I'm open to suggestions. UFO sighting. It's been over 30 years, and I'm still scratching my head over this one. I'm from the Gulf Coast of Texas, and while I lived in a medium-sized city down there, the surrounding countryside is known for all sorts of strange and paranormal events and sightings. I personally don't believe in alien visitations. The energy and resources needed to visit our planet, even coming from the nearest star system, would be insane. I believe that there is other life out there. I just don't believe that it's paying us visits. Still, I was definitely spooked when I was outside after dark at the age of 9. My family lived in a second-story apartment with a large front yard and a parking lot in the back. The lot and yard were connected by 2 breezeways that passed through the building's first floor. The street lights were on, so the entire area was bathed in an orange glow. I was alone when something made me look up at the dark sky. Due to the light pollution, no stars could be seen, so my eyes easily zeroed in on the flashing light that was traveling across the sky in a vaguely northeast to southwest direction. Oh, I thought, it's just a plane. I could see a flashing red light and a steady white light as the object approached my area from behind the apartment building. I watched it slowly get closer, and I noticed something odd then. Due to unlucky genetics, my long-distance vision has never been that great, so an object as distant as a plane, even a low-flying one, should have been fuzzy and indistinct. Yet this object was fairly clear to me. I could see the light shining on the underside. I could see the briefest sight of whatever shape the flashing red light was mounted on as it blinked on and off. It occurred to me then that for me to be seeing it so clearly, it had to be very low. Low enough that I should have been able to see it better, enough to see lights from the city reflecting off of it. Yet outside of the areas illuminated by the object's own lights, there was nothing but blackness. It was almost as if the rest of the object wasn't there at all. I started to feel a little creeped out then, and it was then that I noticed something else. The object was completely silent. No engines, no whirring propellers, or fan intakes. No rotor blades chopping the air. Just total silence. Even jets passing over at 35,000 feet can be heard if one is in a quiet enough area, so I should have had no problem hearing this thing as it closed in on my location. The hair on my arm stood up, and I was hit with the need to hide. I had to get out of sight immediately. I dove into the nearest breezeway and went halfway down, so I could only be seen if the thing landed. Which I hoped/prayed it wouldn't. I stayed there for several minutes, until I worked up the nerve to peek out. It was gone, and I ran up the stairs and down the walkway to my family's home, where I told no one of what I had seen. Before the Greys, there were the weirdos. If you thought the Greys and lizard people were weird, hold on to your seat. Before the 1980s, the beings reported by people were quite unique in nearly every case and very strange in many cases. The Menagerie. 1940, Boulder Mountain, Wyoming, USA. Dutch immigrant Udo Wartena, a miner in the remote mountains of Wyoming, encounters a UFO with 2 white-haired beings who appeared human and dressed in gray overalls and slippers. One being claimed to be 609 years old. The other claimed to be over 900 of your years. They claimed to know over 500 languages. Interestingly, the occupants claimed their power source was hydrogen extracted from water. This is an interesting read if you have the time. 1952, Jessie Reistenberg, Staffordshire, UK. Two beautiful, golden-haired humanoid beings inside a craft hovered over her home as she and her two boys watched. They had long golden hair, just like the old kings. Jessie Reistenberg. 1952, Braxton County, West Virginia, USA. The 10-foot-tall flatwoods monster appeared as a robotic creature with large clawed hands, a head shaped like a spade, huge glowing yellow eyes, and a body that tapered outward toward the bottom like a metallic dress. With a blood-red body and green face, the creature emitted a hissing sound and a foul odor. 1954, Marius de Wilde, France. Witnessed two 3-foot-tall, stocky, humanoid beings wearing suits and clear glass helmets. 1955, Kelly/Hopkinsville, Kentucky, USA. The Kelly/Hopkinsville Goblin Invasion. A group of family and friends, at least 8 witnesses, reported being terrorized by short, glowing goblin-like creatures with large ears and glowing eyes that floated and were impervious to shotgun blasts. 1957, Antonio Villas-Boas, Brazil. One of the first reported abductions was taken aboard a UFO by humans in suits with helmets and breathing apparatus. He was then coerced into having relations with a beautiful but non-quite human woman. 1961, Joe Simonton, Eagle River, Wisconsin, USA. 60-year-old Joe Simonton encounters a UFO just after breakfast landing in his yard. 3 dark-skinned men he described as Italian who never spoke. One of the Italians was cooking on a sort of flameless grill and offered him what Joe described as pancakes that he described as flavorless. Evidence.org has a good write-up of the story as well, as usual. 1966, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, USA. In the fall of 1966, over 100 witnesses reported seeing a 7-foot-tall, winged, flying creature with hypnotic red eyes before the collapse of the Silver Bridge in December 1966. The film The Mothman Prophecies, based on the book by John Keel, is loosely based on the sightings. The film depicts the woo elements of the phenomenon very well. 1967, Herbert Schirmer, Ashland, Nebraska, USA. Police Sergeant Herbert Schirmer, on patrol, was taken aboard a UFO by what appeared to be a human being, although small in stature. The entity was about 5 feet tall, wearing a hooded, tight-fitting gray uniform with black boots, a belt, and gloves. The entity's head appeared abnormally large. The being wore a patch depicting a winged serpent. 1973, Pascagoula, Mississippi, USA. 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker, 2 blue-collar workers out fishing one evening, were abducted by 7-foot-tall robotic creatures and taken aboard a craft. Described as having long, pointy noses, spikes for ears, and hands like crab claws. 1973, Isle of Wight, UK. The Sandown Clown. 2 children reported interacting with a strange, metallic, clown-like being in a house that disappeared when they left. 1974, Carl Higdon, Medicine Bow National Forest, Wyoming, USA. Oil worker Carl Higdon, while out hunting for elk, is abducted by a strange humanoid with a missing left hand, a pike in place of its right hand, and straw for hair. The being called itself Osso-1 had no chin and large buck teeth. 1975, Travis Walton, Sitgreaves National Forest, Snowflake, Arizona, USA. Travis Walton is abducted by a UFO and reappears 5 days later. He reported encountering human-like beings aboard the craft. 1976, Dr. Herbert Hopkins, Old Orchard Beach, Maine, USA. A 58-year-old psychologist and hypnotist, investigating the UFO experiences of David Stevens and Glenn Gray, is visited by a strange, almost robotic man in black who adjures him to destroy all of his tapes and records of his investigations of the Stevens incident. 1977, Antonio La Rubia, Paciencia, Brazil. Abducted by robotic, floating beings with long tendrils for arms and a single post in place of legs and feet. 1979, Robert Taylor, Deekmont Woods, Scotland. A 60-year-old forestry worker sees a landed UFO in the forest and is then attacked by large, spiked metal spheres, knocking him down and tearing his pants. The spheres were dragging him toward the UFO when he lost consciousness. 1983, Alfred Bartu, Aldershot, Hampshire, UK. 77-year-old Alfred Bartu is taken aboard a craft while out fishing during the day. The occupants wore green overalls and helmets with blackened visors. After an examination under an amber light, they said he could go because he was too old and too infirm for our purposes. 1987, Ilkley Moor, UK. Retired police officer Philip Spencer, while walking from Ilkley to East Morton, encounters and photographs a 5-foot-tall, green humanoid creature with long arms and then witnesses a silvery disc-shaped craft ascend up and out of sight. He experiences missing time during this. 1993, Kadima, Israel. Multiple witnesses encounter 9-foot-tall beings with large eyes traversing the countryside. My great-grandmother, the devil, and aliens. I've always carried these two stories around, so I thought I'd share. I hope I'm not abusing the encounter tag, as it's not my encounter but rather my late great-grandmother's. How she met the devil and aliens gave her a stroke. First, some information about my great-grandmother, Gigi. She was born to immigrant parents in 1911 and passed away at the age of 94. Her father was an Englishman, and her mother was Luxembourgian. Most of her family spoke German as well as English, however, Gigi only knew a little German. Gigi's mother only spoke German and was also almost completely deaf. Gigi relied on either her sisters to translate the mangled German or a crude family sign language they had developed. Gigi grew up in rural North Dakota, and, to frame the time period, she once told me about how when she was a little girl, her family would regularly barter with members of the Mandan tribe, whom she described as real Indians, not like today. She also only attended the local school to about the 6th grade. Later in life, she was not particularly bright, but not dumb. She was religious, but not a Bible thumper. The type of woman who would give you a religious birthday card and a Ninja Turtle action figure, who had a picture of Jesus but never said grace. The one thing she was always very serious about was how she met the devil. Gigi would tell this story when prompted, but she never seemed to enjoy it and was always consistent in her description. When she was 10 years old, she was misbehaving. Her father wasn't home, and her mother again didn't speak English. Her mother attempted to control her, but Gigi just ignored her. Finally, her mother tried to grab a hold of her, but Gigi flailed and almost hit her mother. Gigi's mother caught Gigi's hand and looked Gigi cold in the eyes. She let Gigi go, pointed at the closet, and left the room. Gigi and her siblings were often sent to the closet as a sort of timeout, and Gigi knew she had messed up, so she went to accept her punishment. When she opened the door, however, something was inside. Gigi said the being had hooves and was covered in dark fur, which subsided a bit on the torso/chest up to the face. The being had a man's face, with dark eyes, an unkempt beard, and a mop of dirty black hair. And from only one side of its head rose a deer antler. Gigi said the being stepped forward slightly before she slammed the closet door shut. She shrieked, and her mother came to see what the commotion was. Gigi could only really cry and wave her arms, but her mother opened the closet door anyway. The being was gone. She was always very serious about that story, and admittedly, writing it even now makes me feel off somehow. That's the story of how my great-grandma met the devil. However, she also said aliens gave her a stroke. A few years before she died, Gigi had a number of strokes. She was in her 90s at the time. The first was not debilitating, it just took some time to recover. Some more quick info: Gigi and her husband, my great-grandfather, adored fast food. They had to substance hunt during the Depression to feed their children, so they marveled at good food fast. Great-grandpa loved McDonald's, but Gigi loved pizza, specifically Godfather's Pizza. After she had mostly recovered from her stroke, my family took my great-grandparents to Godfather's as a kind of celebration. Being a dumb kid, I got a bunch of quarters from my dad for arcade games and ignored my nonagenarian great-grandparents. To this day I regret not spending more time with them. I had an odd number of quarters after the games, and the restaurant had one of those little toy dispensers, the ones with the plastic egg things. I bought one with my last quarter, and it was a tiny plastic alien giving a peace sign. Done with the games, I returned to the table. I was fiddling with the alien, classic gray-looking, and Gigi noticed it. When I set the alien down, Gigi took it and inspected it closely. With everyone at the table, she held up the alien and looked at me and said, "These are the things that came and got me." My mom, half laughing, said, "What, Grandma?" Gigi repeated herself and then said they were the reason she was in the hospital. When my grandfather, Gigi's son-in-law, told her she was in the hospital because of a stroke, she said, "Them things gave me the stroke." The family just sort of stopped pressing at this point, and things settled down. Most of my family chalked it up to a joke or her stroke. I don't buy it as a joke. Gigi was sweet but not a joker. Furthermore, I don't think she knew what a gray alien was. She hadn't seen a movie since the 1950s, she didn't watch TV, and she only really read the newspaper. She mostly did crafts and listened to music in her spare time. As for it being a stroke hallucination, maybe. But it's still weird. Anyhow, those are the stories of how my great-grandmother met the devil and how space aliens gave her a stroke. It's the first time I tell this story in public, but this community convinced me to do so anyway. Back to us. It was a night back when I was about 8 years old. I had a very lucid dream that night, so lucid that I still remember the dream. It had a pretty simple plot. In the dream I was living with my dad in a house with no windows, fairly dark, and all painted in orange. In the dream I was trying to sleep but I couldn't, so I went to tell my dad that was in the kitchen reading a journal. Then my point of view shifted from mine to my father's and started seeing what he was reading, and as soon as I put my eyes on the journal I saw a skeleton skull that was laughing at me. I immediately woke up. Little do I know, I was waking up into a worse nightmare. Why? Because this time it was real. My bedroom was simple. My bed was located in front of my bedroom's door, so when I woke up I could see the door that was usually closed, and at the time I typically slept with a little light on, put onto a nightstand. Back to us. I woke up, and out of the corner of my eyes, I saw an entity standing in front of my nightstand. Initially, I didn't give it a lot of attention, but then after I rubbed my eyes, I saw that thing was real and was not just a shadow or my imagination. I started freaking out, and as any child would have done, I started giving myself pinches, trying to wake myself up, but nothing. I was definitely awake. At this point I started looking at it, and I could clearly see a gray alien shaped. After years I came to this conclusion, more or like 5'3", didn't have any clothes on, had an elongated skull, and had his back to me, as it was looking at something over my nightstand, and that is a huge particular. Remember this for later. At that point in my mind, I had two choices. 1. Screaming at the top of my lungs to take my parents' attention and ask for their help. But I was not sure if they would have woke up or not, differently from this entity that would have definitely known I was awake. 2. I could look the other way and go back to sleep/stay awake until my mama would have opened my bedroom's door to wake me up, with a ducking alien in my room. I felt threatened. That was a live or die decision to me. What would have you done? After a lot of time, I came up with my decision, screaming for help. I screamed as loud as I could and got the attention of both my mother and this alien figure, which, from having its back in me, rotated a little bit, showing off a large black eye, like a proper gray, and started staring at me, motionless. We stared at each other for what seemed to me an eternity, until my mother opened up the bedroom's door and put the main light on. In that exact moment, I saw that figure disappear in thin air. That night I slept with my parents, telling me it was just a lucid dream. After that, more than 10 years later, my dad reminded me of this episode, which my brain completely erased from the back of my mind, and proceeded to tell me that the following day, while I was not at home, he came into my bedrooms, started looking around, and realized that on top of my nightstand there was some Star Wars Lego, such as spaceships and a Lego shuttle, everything related to the space. I still have goosebumps thinking about that terrible night, and now I'm happy I can share some of them with y'all. My dad told me a story about the first few months he and my mom dated before they got married. Now, first of all, let me say that my dad has never had any reason to tell anyone this as a joke or to get attention. He just wasn't like that. Anyways, he said he and my mom were out driving around one night. I think this was either in Connecticut or Maine, I can't remember. He said he saw lights appear in his rear view mirror and slowed down to the shoulder of the road to let them pass, but they wouldn't pass. So he ran out of shoulder room and was forced to get back on the road. Whoever was behind him was so close they must have been nearly touching bumpers. My dad thought he had a tailgater, so he gradually slowed down to about 20 miles per hour just to piss them off and get them to go around. But they didn't. They just stayed on his ass. This happened in a wooded park area near a lake, and he saw a rest stop, so he pulled over and parked, expecting to see the car go by or, God forbid, pull in to confront them for some reason. They saw no lights go by, so my dad turned off his lights, then turned off the engine, and he and my mom just sat there in their car at the rest stop, obviously anxious about why this person had been following them so aggressively. About 15 minutes passed, and my dad decided whoever it was must have gotten bored of messing with them and went on their way. He started his car, flipped the lights on, and then he and my mom just froze. He said there was a tall, thin silhouette of a man in a black suit of some sort with very long, lanky arms. He switched his high beams on, and in the split second between the lights changing, a second figure appeared. They didn't move, they just stood there. My mom started freaking out and telling my dad to turn off the lights, so he did, and when that happened, the figures were no longer there. Now here is the crazy part. He said just a moment ago the car had been on even though the lights were off, but he had to start the car again. And as they pulled away from the rest stop, the sun was starting to come up. The thing is, all of this had happened over the course of 30 minutes, shortly before midnight. So somehow 6 hours had passed without them knowing. He said they felt really out of it, very achy and sleepy. As some people do, he tried to rationalize it and rarely spoke of it to anyone afterwards. He said my mom denies that it ever happened. That was a dream. Really? 2 people sharing the same dream? Anyways, he did share one final tidbit with me. As he was washing his car a few days later, he said that the trunk of the car looked as though the paint had bubbled and started chipping away as if it had been exposed to a really high source of heat. Humanoid/alien close encounter cases from the Nordic countries. The Girl and the Greys? Målselv in northern Norway, sometime in the 1950s. This is a story that was told by a woman many years after it happened. This took place when she was only 7 or 8 years old. At the time of the incident, she was out playing by a river close to her home. She then saw a gray oval object on the other side of the river. It disappeared in and out of the forest. The girl waved and smiled at the craft. After a while, it came slowly and calmly gliding over the river and landed close to the girl. Of course she didn't know what this was. A hatch opened, and at first she thought it was people coming out of the craft, but then she saw they were not humans. The beings were around the same height as the girl. They were pale and had big, dark eyes, a small, snarled mouth, and a nose that was barely visible. Despite this, the girl was not afraid. They said that they were going to look at her and take some tests. The beings looked at her teeth, took off her boots, looked at her feet, and then took some samples. When the survey was ready, they asked if she wanted to follow them and see how they were living on their home planet. The girl thought of her mother and therefore did not want to come along. Then they promised to come back again, entered the craft, and waved to her. Then the craft took off and went straight up into the air. Finally, the craft was so tiny that the girl could no longer see it. The woman remembered that the beings had not been talking to her during the whole encounter. They had been communicating telepathically all the time. Was this an early authentic Grey encounter? Or was this only something from the girl's imagination, later remembered as memory by the woman and affected by pop culture of what an alien should look like? We will probably never know. 2. The mystery in Imjärvi. Imjärvi in southern Finland, January 7, 1970. It was late afternoon, and 2 friends were out cross-country skiing, Arno Heinonen 36 and Esko Vilho 38. It was dusk, cold -17 degrees Celsius, 1.4 F, and no wind. The men came to a clearing, where they rested a little. After a few minutes, they heard a humming sound. Both Arno and Esko looked up to see a bright light coming from the north, which looked like a brilliant, pulsating cloud. It stopped above the men and slowly began to descend toward them. At a height of about 15 meters, 45 feet, they could make out a ship inside the cloud. It was maybe 3 meters, 10 feet, in diameter and had 3 balls underneath, looked a bit like a typical Adamski ship. The saucer now came closer, and the buzzing got louder. At about 3 to 4 meters, 9 to 12 feet, above the men, it stopped, and the sound stopped. The cloud had now almost disappeared. Suddenly they saw a bright beam of light from the underside of the ship, coming down towards the snow and illuminating it, like a lone spotlight on a stage. Now a red-gray mist also descends around the 2 men. Then the light disappears as quickly as it came. But soon it comes back, and now they see a small creature standing in the middle of the cone of light 3 meters, 9 feet, from them. It was 1 meter high, 3 feet, and narrow. The face was pale, with small eyes and a sharp witch-like nose. On its head it had a pointy helmet or cap. On the body, the creature wore a light green tight-fitting overall or jumpsuit. It had dark green tall boots and white long gloves. In both of its hands it held a small glowing device, which it then pointed at Arno and Esko. The pulsing light that came at the men was intense and blinding. As the creature stood there and pointed the light at the men, sparks began to fly around the red-gray mist, and the mist began to thicken more and more. Finally, they could no longer see the creature or each other. Suddenly the beam of light on the ground got smaller and smaller and floated upwards towards the ship and disappeared. Then the fog also fell away. The forest was now quiet and empty, and the men could see each other again. Of the creature and the ship, there was no trace. They just stood there looking at each other in silence for several minutes. Now Arno noticed that his right side felt strange, it stung, and when he took a step forward with the ski, he collapsed. He couldn't get up, even though he tried several times. Esko had to help Arno home, and it took them an hour to walk 2 kilometers, 1.25 miles, through the snow. When they got home to Arno's cabin, he had a backache, a headache, difficulty breathing, and felt so bad that he had to vomit. When Arno then went to urinate, the urine was black as coffee. These symptoms continued on and off for several months until the summer. He also had a fever at times and difficulty with balance. He was also unable to work during this period. Vulho also suffered from health problems. When he dropped off Arno, his face swelled up and turned red. He also had difficulty with his balance. A few days later, Vulho started to become sensitive to light. And tingling in the feet appeared. Vulho's symptoms also remained for several months. Doctors who examined the two men believed they were exposed to radioactive radiation. In the month of June, a reporting team investigated the place where the two men had their terrible encounter that night. And several people on the team complained of headaches and red hands. Other people who visited the site after the incident have also claimed to have felt ill for days afterwards. Exactly what really happened that late afternoon in Imjarby is still a mystery. And we will probably never get an answer. But we see similarities with other UFO cases where people have had close contact with UFOs, orbs, or aliens, and that is that many have injuries similar to those caused by exposure to too much radioactive or ultraviolet radiation. When I was 5 years old, I had the bedroom intrusion experience described by Whitley Strieber in Communion. This was almost 2 decades before that book came out. I got the little blue doctors exactly as shown in the movie, as well as some other details that match. I don't remember much beyond the initial phase of the experience. Never went for any hypnotic regression to retrieve, or possibly manufacture, any repressed memories regarding the events. I never told anyone about the whole thing or regarded it as any sort of alien abduction scenario until after Communion appeared. I had always thought of the little blue doctors as munchkins or dwarves, not space aliens. Having no way to make sense of the experience, I had always, even at the age of 5, written it off as a very strange and compelling sort of dream or hallucination. Even now, that is the explanation I have to favor. What's interesting is, how can many people spontaneously have the exact same dream or hallucination? Also interesting are other features of the experience that aren't consistent with a purely psychological explanation. In any case, I don't say that I was abducted by aliens. I say that I had the experience that later came to be called alien abduction. I've studied it closely and still don't know what it is. I think there must be a kind of Jungian dimension to it. Ghost, alien, or natural phenomenon? This event took place in Red River Gorge, Kentucky. For anyone that might be familiar with the area, there is a small parking lot near some bathrooms and picnic tables, close to a sign that says Skybridge on the drive through the canyon. My fiancé and I decided to go to the gorge for the day and do some hiking in the area, and then hike down a steep trail near the aforementioned parking lot to do some stargazing when it started getting dark. It gets dark enough there to see the Milky Way. The parking lot is near some campsites, and the trail starts at the back of one of them. Walking through the campsites, we didn't see anyone. We started heading down the trail to one of my favorite spots in the gorge. The trail is heavily wooded, steep, and near the edge of a cliff at some points, so it isn't often traveled. We made it down safely to our destination. There are some really cool places to camp down there, and I had done so maybe half a dozen times before this. We had just brought a blanket and pillow to look at the stars. We went out on a massive rock that jutted out in the middle of the canyon. There was a massive drop on all sides of this rock, but it was big enough to be comfortable to lay on. So we were just lying on the blanket and pillow we had brought, and it was starting to get dark. The sun had just set, and I was looking straight up. Now I'm still not sure if this is related to the rest of what transpired, but as I was looking up something caught my eye. Something seemed to be reflecting in my eye, similar to when bright light reflects off a mirror from a distance. After maybe 10 seconds, it stopped happening. I told my fiancé, and we figured it was just a star doing something a bit strange. About a minute after that, we heard a very loud bang behind us like a gunshot, and it sounded close. This put us a bit on edge, but it was about a week after the 4th of July, so we figured maybe someone had moved into one of the campsites we had walked through and set off a firecracker or something. After a few seconds of looking around, I rested back down on the blanket to look at the stars some more, but right then my fiancé started tapping my shoulder a bit frantically and said, "What is that?" pointing to a location back on the cliff behind us. I sat up, and there was a large glowing red ball of light near the cliff behind us. This orb of light was very bright and very red. Bright enough that it was a bit difficult to look at directly, though not as intense as something like the sun. My first thought was a flare, but this thing was quite huge. Judging from the trees behind it, it was 6 to 8 feet across. It was also a well-defined, perfect spherical shape. It seemed to be pulsating with energy, growing and shrinking in size a bit as it moved around. One thing that stood out is that it was clearly in front of the trees and the cliff behind it, instead of behind the trees as you'd expect if it were a person holding something. It was casting a red light on everything behind it. It started at about the level of the edge of the cliff and started rising. It rose up in front of the trees until it was near the tops of the trees on the edge of the cliff. It moved very smoothly, gliding around at a slow, constant pace. Then it started to descend. It went downward to around the tops of the trees below the edge of the cliff. It seemed to pause for a few seconds and then start moving in a straight line to the left. After going to the left, it stops again and starts to hover back up the side of the sheer cliff until it was about halfway up the trees on the edge of the cliff. As I said, it seemed to be pulsating, changing sizes slightly but staying around the same average size, but now it seemed to be getting bigger. Except I realized it wasn't actually changing sizes much, it was coming towards us. About that time our amazement turned to horror as we realized we were on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to run and a red ball of who knows what coming at us. However, just then it changed directions again, but this time very quickly. It almost instantly just shot back towards the cliff and into the forest. We could see it darting between trees, and in the matter of a second or two, its red glow had disappeared into the woods. I turned to my fiancée and said, "So? Time to go?" The unfortunate thing is that the place it had vanished into the forest was pretty close to the trail we needed to take back to the parking lot. So we waited a few minutes to make sure the coast was clear and booked it back up the trail. Fortunately, the trip back up was pretty uneventful. The only strange thing was how quiet it seemed. It was nearly perfectly silent except for our own footsteps and the sound of us brushing through the plants as we climbed the steep trail. We made it back to the car and got the duck out of there. After the event, I tried to make some kind of sense out of it, as I am pretty skeptical of paranormal stuff. The orb of light was present for about a minute before retreating into the trees. The only thing I can really think of that it could have been besides something paranormal is ball lightning. I'm not sure if ball lightning only shows up during storms though, because it was perfectly clear, not a cloud in the sky. Also, it seems strange that ball lightning would be bright red as opposed to white or something. Plus, its slow, precise movements didn't seem like something natural. I went back before dusk a couple weeks later to the same spot, alone this time. My fiancée refuses to ever go back. I was hoping to see if I could witness something similar and actually be ready to videotape at that time. That is when I took the pics but had no luck seeing whatever that was again, though that's probably a good thing. I'm not sure, but I'll explain my experience, and perhaps you can make your own determination. Long ago, almost 19 years actually, I was a 15-year-old kid hanging out with my friends. One of which was 16 and had a license and car, so we decided to go see a movie in the next town over, which is roughly 10 miles away. The particular stretch of highway used to get between the two towns was fairly isolated at the time, and thus it only took 15 minutes at the maximum to get from point A, movie theater, to point B, home. To set the scene, it was about 10 p.m. as we left the theater and went directly home from the movie. It was an early 90s model Toyota Camry, and in the car was the driver, a passenger beside him. He called shotgun before me, and I was in the back seat sort of leaning forward in between the two front seats to talk to my friends. We were listening to Green Day's album Dookie, Don't Judge Me, and more or less just jamming out to that tape as we headed home. At roughly the halfway point, I have a sudden urge to look over to my left, and up into the cloud cover I see an illuminated, somewhat oblong shape moving through the clouds in what could have been interpreted as an intercept course with our vehicle. I stared at it for a few seconds and said, "Hey guys, check that out." And my friends both turned to see what I was pointing at. The next moment that I recall we're sitting in the car, still moving down the highway, and it's completely silent, no music, no talking, nothing. Then, all of a sudden, the tape player starts back up right in mid-song loudly, and it startles us because it was just so ominously quiet. We all thought that was pretty odd considering none of us have any recollection of the tape stopping or anything like that. We eject the tape, pop it back in, and it's fine, just like it had always been prior to that. But, upon playing with the radio, we see the clock, and it's nearly 30 minutes later than it should have been. Somewhere between us spotting the weird illuminated object in the clouds and the tape mysteriously starting to play after a brief silence, we lost about 30 minutes. What normally was a 15-minute car ride, that I had taken ever since I was a kid, this time took nearly 45 minutes. I know this for certain because I was later than expected getting home and my parents weren't exactly pleased. It was a school night. So, there you have it. That's my story, and both other guys could confirm it if I ever brought it up with them. We talked about it briefly for the next week or so, but eventually it sort of faded away as a topic of interest. I still think about it from time to time, but to this day, I don't know what I saw or what happened with my missing time. Unexplained lights in the Alberta wilderness. My fiancée and I are hugely into camping. This particular season where the incident happened, we discovered the perfect little hideaway clearing way out in the Crown Land, about an hour west/northwest of Cremona. We had made about 6 trips out there already, some with a large group of friends and some with just a couple of us, so we were starting to become quite familiar with the area from exploring. This specific trip was a bigger one. We had about 10 people with us, one of whom is my lifelong best friend of 18 years. To add a little bit of context to this, my best friend and I strongly believe in extraterrestrial and paranormal events. So much so that we successfully signaled a UFO on a beach when we were 12, but that's a story for another time. My best friend and I, we'll call her Kay, were talking about the UFO on the beach around the campfire with everyone. A choice few people were more interested than others. 5 of us decided it would be a really cool and brilliant idea to try and signal something again. Before, we used a flashlight to create a specific pattern of flashes into the sky, so why not try that again? I remembered the pattern, after all. We grabbed a couple flashlights, went and laid down in a nearby field, and began flashing lights into the sky while slightly drunk, as camping usually goes. The first few minutes consisted of nothing but our half-inebriated giggles, but then Kay spoke up and asked us if we were seeing what she was. We all focused harder on the sky, and lo and behold, there was a flickering light twice as prominent as the other stars, even Venus. It staggered in all directions for a few seconds before setting on a steady trail over the tree line until we couldn't see it anymore. Thoroughly spooked, we jogged back to camp to tell everyone else what happened. Of course, most of them brushed it off as us being a little drunk, but we all saw the exact same thing. Strange lights in the sky were forgotten. We spent the next couple hours around the fire with everyone. One of the more skeptical guys in the group went off to pee but stopped right at the entrance to the clearing and said something along the lines of what the duck is that? Which caused the rest of us to go see what he was looking at. Just a quick pause to set the scene. Our clearing that we camp in is smaller, only about 30 feet around, set back in a tree line roughly 15 to 20 yards from the dirt road that runs through the crown land. Directly across the road from our spot is a small river backing out onto thick forest and low mountains for miles. When we got to the entrance, we saw a massive, brilliant spotlight shining over the highest mountain peak across the road. It almost looked like the sunrise, except it was 1 a.m. and entirely in the wrong direction. Someone's immediate reaction was to say it was a truck, but that was quickly discounted because we knew the only roads and trails around there did not go up that mountain. Another theory was that it might have been a combine, since there are plenty of farms around the area. More likely, except this light was so big it looked like the source would have to have been as large as a medium-sized yacht. As we were arguing about the possibilities, the light started to slowly beam across the mountaintop, like it was moving sideways. Definitely not a combine. The light would have had to point in the direction it was moving instead of focusing in our direction the whole time, just slowly sliding right and left. We all just stared in awe at this weird light for about 10 more seconds, until it darted back across the ridge to its original position, all the while still shining towards us. It moved way too swiftly for a vehicle or farm equipment. We no longer had any theories of where it was coming from. A mere few seconds after it stopped, it faded away so slowly that you wouldn't be able to tell it was dimming unless you looked away for a second or two. Eventually it disappeared completely. Thoroughly creeped out and chilled to the bone from the early September weather, we quickly made our way back to the fire. None of us can explain the light we saw that night, but it definitely left all of us with a very uneasy feeling. I had nightmares the remaining 2 nights we were there, but there were no more unexplainable events. Location: Adams County, Illinois. Date: August 16, 2011. Time: night. The witness was lying in bed with his dog at his feet. His bed was located under a window. The neighborhood was quiet, and it was dark out late at night in this suburban neighborhood. He then saw a yellow-orange light that was thick and covered everything. He could see through the light, but it covered the complete view from his bedroom window. It did not affect his eyes like the sun does. He also heard a strange humming while watching the light, trying to figure out what it was. He had never seen anything like it before. He is not certain how much time passed, but it was neither seconds nor hours, maybe 20 minutes or so as he was stunned by this light display. He was scared and closed his window as he peered out in the light. The light then disappeared, and everything was in view again like normal. He could see the house across the street and see the street lights lit up dimly as always. He then heard a noise at his other window, just 8 feet from his bed. He looked as his dog began to growl. He is protective and a watchdog. He went to rise from the bed but suddenly froze. He was frozen stiff, just his eyes could move, and the witness could see his breathing was heavy as he growled, but still stiff as a statue. The witness panicked and looked back to the window where he heard the noise. He remained in his bed by his dog's side. He saw a hand coming through the screen, as it must have punched a hole through the screen. He had the window slightly opened as always. The hand was grayish and smooth, with long fingers and strange bulbous joints and fingertips. The witness was terrified as the screen was then pulled out and the window lifted further. A creature then crawled into his now opened window and crouched in the window, staring at the witness, his dog still frozen and growling. Somehow he knew that the creature had some kind of power to do this to his dog. It was a small creature, grayish all over, smooth skin all over with large almond-like eyes and black eyes that protruded. They almost looked like glass. There were no pupils, just pitch black eyes. The head was the typical alien head as described by other witnesses. Teardrop-shaped and larger than expected in proportion to the small body, it had long, very thin arms. The feet were long, and it began to climb down from the window slowly as it stared at the witness, never blinking. The witness was terrifying but was not sure if he was paralyzed. He thought of running for the door but changed his mind, as he could have never made it past the creature to get there. After the creature began to climb down from the window, the witness doesn't remember anything else until he woke up in the morning with everything seemingly normal, including his dog, a 70-pound Rottweiler. He ran to the window, remembering the night's events, and the window was raised up all the way, which he never did. The screen was lying on the driveway below his window. He ran downstairs to the driveway to look for the hole in the screen, and sure enough, the small punch-through hole from the creature was there. A day later, he noticed a raised bump on his wrist. The skin was white in the raised area, it was rounded and small. Me and my friend TJ back in 2018 used to do a lot of cryptid/ghost hunting, and especially because we're from there's a lot of stories of areas with crazy histories. An example is the woods, a block from my house that has stone steps in the middle of it, completely out of the way from everything. Basically, long story short, the stairs were from a church that burned down long ago, and rumor has it people died in that fire, and that's why the woods are haunted now. Me and my friend B saw some shit in those woods too, different story, but with this image in your head now you can understand has a lot of paranormal activity. Now back to the main story. Me and TJ one night found out the Conjuring House, Burrillville, is like a 20-minute drive from us, so we decided to check it out. It was about 2 a.m. when we started driving there, and a lot of weird shit started to happen when we got to the first road to the way to the house. For reference to how creepy this area was, it was practically out in the middle of the sticks, barely any street lights, and lastly, the energy was the strangest. It felt like we were being watched all the way to the house. When the GPS said about 3 minutes away from the house, TJ's radio started glitching, repeating the chorus of R.I.P. by Joji. Needless to say, the vibe got a lot darker after that and when we actually arrived. When we got there, not much happened until we were about to leave. The vibe was growing worse the longer we stayed, and then TJ heard something, so we left because the energy was something different. As we were leaving, the GPS quickly made us turn to a road different from the way we came, as soon as we were approaching the original entrance to the street of the Conjuring House. At the time, we didn't think much of it because we were just trying to leave the area because of the way it was making us feel. This road was a lot creepier than the others because of how it brought us directly in the middle of the woods. Even some parts weren't paved, if remembering correctly, with really weird looking houses spaced apart. Well, as we were going down the road, I looked down at my phone, and in that second, TJ started punching my arm, yelling "Look up bro what the duck," and as I looked up, the strangest thing I've ever seen in my life jumped across the road like 5 feet away from the car and into the woods at the speed of a ducking cheetah. To give you guys a better idea of what it looked like. First, it was as tall as a kangaroo, and I mean the tall ones, the thing had to be 7 feet. Second, it was jumping in medium-sized jumps, not sure what the word for the movement is, but quick, how a gear works. That's how smooth and fast the legs touched the ground, propelled forward, and repeated. Like in the 4 seconds it took to drive the car to where it was on the road, it was like hundreds of feet away into the woods. Lastly, the most amazing but strange thing about it was its actual appearance. It looked like moving energy, a bunch of lines moving together in the shape of this animal-looking thing. And its colors were crazy. It was a combination of neon brown, neon dark green, neon orange, and some other less noticeable colors that sort of filled in the rest of its shape. It was talking. As we drove by, we freaked out, of course, and talked about it the whole ride home, trying to make sense of what we saw. We even tried to find the road we were on that night on 3 separate occasions after that to see if we could maybe see it again, but we never found that road again. That night changed my life because I never thought I'd see something like that so close, but since then been trying to find answers. Thank you to everyone who listened to this. If anyone has any insight into what my friend and I witnessed, please feel free to comment. Again, thank you, and have a good day, y'all. 2 scary close encounters at the remote relay station at Hemliden in Sweden. In some places, the UFO phenomena seem to have a tendency to be reported more often than in others. Paranormal researchers call them hot spots. One such place is Mount Hemliden north of Örnsköldsvik in the middle of Sweden, where many interesting observations have been made. This time I will tell you about two interesting separate close encounter cases that happened in this area. The Nordic UFO newsletter, issue 1, 1981, reported these two stories on pages 8 to 11. Kurt Nielsen and the three mysterious humanoids on the road. October 18, 1977. Kurt Nielsen is the owner of a shortwave radio transmitter, which he has installed in his car, and in order to achieve better communication than he was experiencing in the small village of Trehörningsö, he drove up to the TV and radio transmitting station that lies about 10 kilometers to the north and is situated on a mountain known as Hemliden, which is a lonely, isolated area. 400 meters, approximately 440 yards, from the top of the mountain, he noticed heavy radio interference, and a distant colleague with whom he was in contact could hardly hear him, although Kurt could hear his colleague clearly through. At 8 p.m., Kurt reached the transmission station's mast but found communications there so bad that he had to break off the radio conversation with his friend. Kurt's attention was then caught by a pale blue object outlined against a hillock down in a hollow. He realized after a few moments that it was a machine with a dome, and although it was difficult to estimate, it was about a couple of meters, 6 to 7 feet, in diameter. In front of the object there were three figures dressed in spacesuits, each about 1 meter, 4 feet, tall and of a grayish color, all at a distance of a little over 100 meters, 110 yards. They could clearly be seen in the light emitted by the machine, and Kurt was so surprised that he switched on the car's headlights to see them more clearly. Everything then went black, and the figures in the machine could no longer be seen. Kurt explained that although the car's lights worked all right, the figures in the machine were no longer visible. Kurt sat rooted to the spot looking at the emptiness for about 1 minute, after which everything again returned to as it was with the machine shining again. Kurt was really frightened now, and he began to drive away, but only after 50 meters, 55 yards, the car stopped, and there in the middle of the road were the three figures, either the same ones as before or a different team. Kurt thought they were crossing the road but didn't know if it was he or they who stopped the car. The figure in the middle had a spade-shaped thing in his hands, which was then turned completely around, causing the figure to cross its arms, the convex side of the spade now facing Kurt. At the same instant, the car's lights and engine died. Just before the figure rotated the spade, the other two figures had focused their gaze on it. It was now pitch black, and Kurt thought, this is the end. However, he switched off the light switch and attempted to start the engine, which fired at once. Feeling greatly relieved, Kurt reversed 10 meters, 11 yards, into the darkness and then waited 2 minutes before turning on the headlights, which also worked. However, the little figures were nowhere to be seen, so Kurt rushed back home. When he got home, Kurt told his wife, Eva, all that had happened. They then noticed that Kurt's watch was losing time. The house clock indicated 8:50 p.m., while his watch said 8:30 p.m. Kurt is acquainted with a man named Kjell Nasland, who had also experienced something similar to Kurt in 1969, and so he called him up at once. Kjell said that he had been having some bad interference on his TV that same evening. It was also noticed that Kurt's dog was acting strangely, for he was barking madly. Usually the dog greets him with a welcoming leap, but this evening was different. The dog finally laid down, huddled up in a corner of the kitchen. He also reacted in a strange way 2 days later when they all went up to Hemliden Mountain. The dog kept behind Kurt all the time, when usually he runs and jumps all over the place. Kurt, though, was still deeply affected by the UFO experience and was stopped by a police car on his way home from the mountain for not dipping his car's headlights when they passed him. Kurt told them he was so upset that he'd forgotten to dip them. An on-the-spot investigation of the area by UFO researcher Reinhold Karleby revealed that something had happened. A birch tree had the bark removed from a part of it where the object was seen. This damage is situated about 2.8 meters, 8 to 9 feet, above the ground, and it seems that the craft never landed and that the 3, or 6, figures descended to the ground in an unknown way. Some moss was missing from the area, but very puzzling was the finding of some moss that does not even grow in the immediate surroundings where the craft was seen but was eventually located where the figures were observed crossing the road, i.e., they were collecting some plant specimens. Also, an important finding was the footprints that the little figures made, these being short, relatively wide, and with a heel measuring 4 centimeters by 4 centimeters, 1.6 by 1.6 inches, that had a cross pattern on it. Together with Kurt at the sighting point, the machine's diameter was estimated more accurately as 5 meters, 16.5 feet. The bluish light emitted by this object only illuminated out to about 5 meters, the little figures that were first seen being lit up by this light. There was no noise at any time. Kurt described the spacesuits as being gray and resembling plastic. The figures were wearing short white boots that fitted them as tight as gloves and seemed to be part of their suits, which were one piece. Their helmets were like those of astronauts, with an opening at the front for their eyes. 2. The strange close encounter occurred on a lonely night at Mount Hemliden relay station. Kjell Naslund, mentioned above, had a strange experience on March 12, 1969, some years before Kurt's sighting. Kjell is the director of the transmitting station on Hemliden, and on this evening he was working alone at the station at 6 o'clock. For some reason the alarm sounded, indicating a fault in the transmitter somewhere. This went on until about 6:30 p.m., when Kjell felt that he had to go outside for some strange reason. Once outside, he saw a massive object, about 150 meters across, 450 feet, 5 to 6 meters high, 17 to 20 feet, and with a fuzzy outline to it, only 15 meters, 45 feet, from the building. A grayish-blue light was emanating from a tunnel leading inside the object, and beside it and inside the tunnel, Kjell could see about 10 box-like things, or could they be robots, that resembled clouds without solid edges, all of them floating just above the ground. He estimated them as 135 centimeters, 4.5 feet, tall. Kjell wanted to phone the police, but for some reason he was unable to do so. In fact, he couldn't even move. 7 or 6 box beings floated into the station, and although they passed right next to Kjell, he couldn't touch them since he was immobilized. He had the feeling that inside these boxes there were creatures and that they were protecting themselves, possibly from the environment. He also felt that he could stay calm, for his visitors were not dangerous. The box beings didn't move quickly and floated along at the same speed as a walking person. 5 to 10 minutes later, the creatures completed their inspection and were sucked into the tunnel, which closed behind the last one. The craft then disappeared to the north. After the craft's disappearance, Kjell was free to move again. The first thing he did was to call his wife. She heard that he was very upset and agitated, and she told him to calm down. "You must have seen wrong," she said. "Wrong? I have not seen wrong," he shouted to her on the telephone. He then called a policeman he knew, Hans Hagblad in Trehorningsö, who took the report seriously. However, his managers at the Sundsvall main transmitting station did not believe him and only laughed at Kjell's report to them. The next day, Kjell went up to the mountain again and could see that the tops of some tall pine trees close to the relay station were broken. Later, when UFO researchers spoke to personnel at the Sundsvall transmitting station, they could confirm that there had been heavy disturbances from the Hemliden relay station that night, and the technicians could not find any explanations as to why. Mutant? Native American spirit? Roswell alien? What did I encounter? Just a few years ago, my friends and I decided to take a road trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico. I had just turned 18 and thought it would be fun to pack up the car with my boys and hit the road. Santa Fe had always seemed interesting to me, as I had never really known or heard much about New Mexico. The drive was thrilling, full of laughs and good music. We checked into our hotel and settled in. We were staying at Hotel Santa Fe, an adobe-style hotel in the center of the tiny town. The town felt strange from the get-go. Maybe it was just me, and I would love any readers to explain why, but there were a few odd things about the town. First of all, most businesses close early, around 5 o'clock or so, and when they close. Doors are locked and lights are out. It seems all the locals are nowhere to be found or asleep by 8. Santa Fe gives off eerie vibes. It's definitely a spiritual small town. But at times it felt like something more sinister was going on, something in the air. But I digress. After settling down in our rooms, we hit the streets to walk and get a bite to eat and shop. There wasn't much that interested our group as we were all teenage boys, and the town is more geared towards older retirees or avid Southwestern art collectors, but nevertheless we were still considerate of the culture and full of curiosity, which would later be a poor mistake. As the evening came, the sky filled with a beautiful pink sunset. Most of my friends in the group were worn out and ready to relax over some beers back at the room, but my closest friend and I still weren't satisfied. We chilled in the room with the group until late into the night, and everyone fell asleep, but our raging curiosity still wasn't cured. You see, me and my friend John were avid urban explorers. We loved exploring abandoned buildings and had a lot of experience. We even made a social media account where we would post pictures and videos of our findings. Now that we were in Santa Fe, we were thrilled to get out and explore the unknown. Around 2 a.m. rolled around, and we snuck out of our hotel room, careful not to wake the others sleeping, and set to the streets for adventure. When we stepped outside into the night, we were greeted with a very peculiar experience. The town was desolate. Like nothing I've ever seen before. No soul was out. So much so that we walked down the middle of the street because there wasn't a car in sight. It was slightly unsettling, as it still felt like we were being watched. An uncanny feeling. The best way I can explain how quiet it is there at night was when we walked down the street and approached an intersection. And jokingly stood under the traffic lights. The town was so empty and quiet we could actually hear the bulb click as the light changed from red to green. It was an odd feeling being the only ones out. I've been in towns at night before, and yes, it's quiet, but there's still the occasional bar open with some distant music or the occasional homeless person, but believe me when I say Santa Fe was empty. We proceeded to explore the town, climbing on top of a few buildings to get pictures and exploring a few buildings. But our curiosity still wasn't cured. We decided to continue walking until we came to a nearby river. Hoping we could find a nearby drainage tunnel we could explore. We proceeded. As we approached the river, we noticed there was a small tunnel/bridge that went over the river. As we walked through the brush and approached the water, we got a better look at the tunnel. It looked like there was a dim light coming from under the bridge. We walked closer and closer without our flashlights on, just enjoying the moonlight. There we were standing at the mouth of the tunnel. Suddenly John whispered to me, "Wow, do you see that?" We were met with an unsettling view of about 10 to 15 candles on the ground lighting up the underside of the bridge. We proceeded to walk in to check out what was going on. Suddenly we heard movement that broke the silence. That's when we immediately turned on our flashlights and focused them into the tunnel. There was a figure sitting on the ground. At first I couldn't tell if it was a pile of rocks, and my eyes were playing tricks on me. We got closer, and the figure moved. That's when I felt my heart start pounding but tried to reassure myself, thinking maybe it's just a homeless person. I focused my flashlights on a smaller beam that would illuminate the figure. We stopped in our tracks and just stood there staring at what my light was fixed on. A bald man with absolutely no hair or anything on the back of his head. Just sitting there looking the opposite direction. My light was shining directly on the back of his head. We stood there for a good 10 seconds, just waiting for him to turn his head around. That's when we realized. Its head was facing us. I shined my light a bit lower to illuminate its torso. This man had absolutely no face. Just perfectly smooth. No ears either. Nothing. Just sitting there, still. It felt like it was starting at us, but there were no eyes. We both realized what we were looking at the same time. John whispered to me, "WH, WH. Where's its face?" That's when it got up. At this moment, I felt my blood run cold. It picked something up off the ground, and we ran. We ran so fast I felt for the first time I was legitimately running for my life. As we exited the tunnel, we ran to the higher ground and got on top of the bridge so the mouth of the tunnel was below us. I shined my flashlight down onto the ground. That's when I saw the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. The thing came out of the tunnel and just stood there. It stepped into the light of my flashlight. It was holding what looked like some sort of weapon. Almost like a metal pitchfork or trident. And looked directly at us. There we were just frozen. I shined my flashlight directly on its face once more, and for a good 20 seconds we just stood there in complete terror as it stood there motionless. No face. Just smooth skin. There were a few features on the top of its bald head. Almost like horns, but I'm not sure what they were. Then suddenly it started bolting toward us. That's when we heard it. It made a strange sound. The best I could describe would be an angry hum. Like if you were to scream with your mouth closed. This thing was angry, running towards us, waving its pitchfork thing in the air. We ran as fast as we could back to the hotel. We finally made it back, still shaking. I felt sick with adrenaline. As we caught our breath in the elevator, we both looked at each other. The next day, we didn't even bother telling the rest of the group. 1, because we knew it sounded too unbelievable, and 2, because we were both shaken up about it. To this day we still don't talk much about what we saw, but recently John mentioned it to me. We were talking about the trip as he lowered his voice and said, "You saw that too, right?" Looking back, I did decide to do some research on New Mexico. Finding out that the government has done many secret experiments in the desert and that the area has many Indian burial grounds, the land is a cocktail for the uncanny. I often wonder if what we saw was some mutant human as a result of the Manhattan Project. A nuclear test was done in the desert of New Mexico. There are rumors that the government not only tested their bombs on test-built structures but also on humans. Maybe we saw a mutant, or maybe it was some sort of native spirit, but I'm still not much of a supernatural believer. Regardless, I will never be able to explain what I saw that night. And I will never forget the view of the faceless man looking at me. My dad's alien plus UFO encounters. Just a warning, some of this may seem pretty outlandish and totally unbelievable, but having known my father my whole life, this whole thing is either one of two things. Either he's got some sort of paranoid delusional disorder along with the rest of his family. My parents separated when I was 5, he remarried and had a daughter with his new wife, Dulce, or he's telling the truth and none of this is made up. He would be the last person on earth I would ever think would dive into any of this kind of stuff. He doesn't have much of an open mind about most things and believes he always has all the right answers to everything. So to hear his story initially gave me the creeps, to say the least. I have taken the following directly from his own words, without any editing. He sent me this document containing all of his experiences, almost too many, so I will only pick 2 experiences from it. May 25, 2012. Large craft seen by my wife. On May 25, 2012, at approximately 3:30 a.m., my wife saw a huge craft, about the size of a football field, maybe double that size, about 1/4 to half mile from our house. It appeared to be a few blocks away. We live in the Killeen area of Miami and live in a large cul-de-sac in a very quiet middle-class neighborhood. The object appeared to be about 100 feet off the ground, and as stated earlier, it was a very large craft illuminated with bright multicolored lights on its side. Even though that object, or angel, as my wife calls it, magically cured our dog from her paralysis, she was still sick, she had an enlarged heart and kidney problems, was taking diuretics and Viagra, and had to go to the bathroom many times per day and night. At approximately 3:30 a.m., our dog notified my wife that she needed to go to the bathroom and was barking loudly. My wife always takes her out to our backyard, but this time, for reasons she does not understand, she opened our front door and brought Nana to our front lawn. She has never taken our dog to the bathroom via our front door at night before or since. When she looked up, in a southwesterly direction, she saw the craft at approximately a 45-degree angle. Attached is Exhibit 3, which is a drawing of the craft made by my wife. It was shaped like a football-shaped cylinder but with pointed triangle edges on both sides, which appeared triangular shaped on each end. The right and left sides, inside the triangle portion of the edges, had 2 large bands of extremely bright multicolored lights on each side. The middle part of the craft appeared very light, whitish or gray colored. The craft made an extremely loud noise, much more powerful than if an airplane were standing directly above our house. The noise was only apparent for less than 1 minute. The object remained stationary for about a few minutes, and then it disappeared. I later researched the weather for that night and found that the visibility was 10 miles and that there were scattered clouds at 3:30 a.m. that night. My wife said that she saw many stars in the sky that night and thus had excellent visibility. She said that this craft blocked out the stars in its line of sight. August 25, 2012. Very large craft seen by 5 individuals. On August 25, 2012, I saw my own huge UFO craft less than 50 feet away from me, and I have been thinking about this experience every day since I saw it. The most important item to retain in this quick summary is that I specifically called this object, it did not just mysteriously appear. I now believe that it was the reverse, that the occupants of this UFO programmed me to act this way. After my wife and I saw the UFO craft and plasma cylinder inside our house on March 18, 2012, I started to seriously begin my research on UFOs and paranormal issues. I purchased and read hundreds of books from Amazon on numerous diverse topics and spent all my free time on the internet. I learned that many individuals, Prophet Yahweh and many others, call UFOs and then record videos of these objects. My wife arrived from Mexico on August 17. Several days later, on a very cloudy night, several days before a tropical storm, at about 9 p.m., a friend of mine called me and informed me that he was coming by and dropping off some of his traffic tickets. I am an attorney and had previously told him that I would write up no contest motions to resolve these tickets for him. He said he was close by and would be at my home in minutes. I decided to wait for him outside. I live in a large cul-de-sac with only 3 houses. My neighborhood has large yards and is very quiet. It was dark and very cloudy. I then decided to play a game. I remembered the Stephen Greer and Prophet Yahweh videos and started to consciously wish to see the large multicolored UFO craft my wife saw on July 8 appear in front of me just like it did for her. Approximately every 2 to 3 minutes, I turned around 360 degrees to see if I saw anything. I did this for about 15 minutes. Just when I was ready to give up, I saw this huge object on top of my neighbor's house and backyard, extending approximately 200 to 300 feet back. The object was not a solid one. It was made up mostly of thousands of very long streaks of circular or oblong-shaped white thin lights. It appeared to me that I saw 2, possibly 3 distinct oblong outlines formed by the perimeters of these white light streaks. One circular object nearest to me was partially covered by the palm trees in front of my neighbor's house. This smaller oblong object was connected to a much larger oblong object as formed by the perimeter of these light streaks. There appeared to be hundreds of swirls of circular white light streaks all inside of this object, all on the outside shell of the object and not on the inside of it. The object was positioned in a horizontal position, rising at approximately a 15-degree angle. It was positioned at about an 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock format. It was about 20 feet from the top of my neighbor's house to the bottom of this object. It is difficult to determine its height, but I would say that the object was about 100 to 200 feet in height. I was clearly very long, I would say at least 300 feet in length. I then started yelling for my daughter to come outside. My daughter had just turned 10 years old. She had told my wife and I that both if she and I had seen UFOs, she wanted to see one as well. After about 1 minute of yelling outside her bedroom, she came out and asked me, "What was that?" I told her that I did not know but believed it was a UFO hiding. She just looked at the object in amazement. After about 2 to 3 minutes of observing this object, my friend, Luis, who is 48 years old, his wife, who is 52 years old, and the daughter of his wife, who is 17 years old, drove up to my house. Both Luis and his wife were trained as engineers in their native countries. Luis is a conservative Catholic who was raised in Mexico. He goes to Catholic Mass every Sunday and participates in various ministries. His wife is from Colombia and is also a college graduate and professional. Both never believed in UFOs. Both he and his wife were shocked and constantly asked me, "What is that?" We all tried to come up with logical explanations, but we clearly could not come up with one that adequately explained this phenomenon. We all doubted whether this was indeed a UFO and discussed that it must be some type of large light anomaly. Suddenly, all throughout the inside of the object, hundreds of starlight objects started to flicker on and off, flashing on and off in a fraction of a second. I was surreal. I believe that because we started to doubt this object, it wanted to put on a show for us to demonstrate to us that in fact it was very real. It indeed was surreal. We were not scared but instead started yelling, "Look at that, look over there," pointing to the stars bursting all over the different parts of the craft. It was clearly putting on a show for us, or at least that was my impression. After about 15 minutes, my friends said they had to go, and they drove off. About 5 minutes later, I believed that mosquitoes were attacking me, and I told my daughter that it was time to go inside because the mosquitoes were killing us. In fact, my daughter told me a half hour later that there were no mosquitoes out that night. After she told me this, I woke up and realized what a fool I was for just walking away from a scenario that should have been the front story of Time magazine and every media outlet around the world if I had captured it on video. I ran outside with my video and digital cameras, but the huge UFO craft was gone. The ironic part was that about a month before this event, after my wife saw the huge multicolored UFO outside our house, I purchased a large telescope, a night vision CCTV camera with adapters to attach this camera to the telescope, an old used Sony camcorder with the old night vision technology, and a digital camera with high-powered zoom for night shots. I said to myself, the next time my wife or I see these objects, we will be prepared to capture them on video and on camera so no one will doubt us. We know what we saw, and they were real. Next time we are going to prove it. The irony was that it never even entered my mind to take any of these newly purchased items out and take a video or a picture. About 30 minutes after I entered my house with my daughter, I came to my senses and ran out with my digital camera and my Sony video cameras, but the UFO had disappeared. I now have been educated through my various readings that I was instructed to go inside and not to take any videos or pictures. I have learned that various individuals having close encounters have experienced similar responses. Our minds were totally controlled. I believe that I was controlled like a zombie. Since that August 2012 sighting, my wife and I have not seen any other UFOs or similar objects either inside or outside our home. Every day I think about what I saw and have become compulsive over these sightings, and these visions have affected my work and my outlook on life, our role in our universe, and our relationship as spirits with God. I am a changed person. I think I found out the nature of alien abductions and the UFOs in general. I read Extradimensional Universe, where the paranormal becomes the normal by John R. Violette, and it said, more or less, the following conclusions about the nature of alien abductions and, by extension, the UFO phenomenon. First off, they're extradimensional, as the title says, not extraterrestrials. Now, second off, a quote from the book, The Aliens, live in a different, larger world of space-time. The aliens also show a keen interest in the abductee's sense of time. Some have assumed this is intelligence gathering, but it is much more likely intelligence or consciousness testing. 4. One's ascent to higher consciousness. Third off, Almost all abductees are given messages about impending catastrophes that will render man sterile if not extinct. Some prefer to interpret all this as a warning to change our destructive ways, or these scenarios may come to pass. But taken at face value, the truth seems to be that humankind, with just the use, or misuse, of self-consciousness, is far enough down the path of self-annihilation that its demise is virtually inevitable. Fourth off, the aliens are producing a hybrid race. The objective is to preserve our genetic seed in an improved evolutionary form bred to carry the higher faculty if we, as they clearly expect, do not survive our crisis stage. Presumably, this hybrid race will then be raised and prepared to either repopulate the Earth or start anew on some other planet. Fifth off, why do abductions run across family generations? B. Rhine speculated that ESP, a lower branch of the faculty, was inheritable as well. Abductees have it, and the aliens are accelerating the evolutionary process in these, the most suitable bloodlines, to bring about in succeeding generations a new genotype, one better endowed with the natural ingredient for the higher faculty. Some more quotes. Why are these particular abductees selected? It's obvious that the abductees have something the aliens want. It is that person's capacity for the higher faculty. My wife and I were asleep, and I heard tapping on the window that woke me up. I just rolled over, and I mumbled "ignore it, babe" vaguely in my sleep. It was very annoying because I had the next day off, so I was actually planning to have a lay-in, my one day off, and I get woken up in the middle of the night. Rolling over and checking my phone time, it says 2:34 a.m. I sensed that I needed to use the bathroom and make my way out of bed. While opening the bedroom door, I can see small red lights that appeared in our hallway, and by now I'm fully awake. The lights were only there for a few seconds but were very bright, and I shrugged it off as car lights. I know I wasn't thinking right, and a part of me knew that it wasn't, but I honestly just wanted to do my business and then go back to bed. Halfway down the hall, I get to our toilet and flick on the light. I do my business and wash my hands. While wiping my hands onto our towel, I quickly see something run past the door. I mean, ducking run. We have no dogs because I'm allergic, and we don't have any kids yet. Immediately my back is up, and I slowly creep out of the hallway and fling on the lights. So many horror films I've seen just walk out in the dark to investigate, like, WTF? I make my way slowly to the bedroom, and I double lock the bedroom door. I figured that it was just some animal that somehow found their way into our house, and me turning on the light scared it away. I'd also like to see an animal undo a double locked door. I thought that I'd deal with whatever aftermath tomorrow morning. I must have fallen asleep because I awoke to the light just creeping in from the curtains. Turning over to cuddle my wife, I can see she's already awake and staring up at me. Her eyes straight away go from looking at me to the middle of the room. In the corner of the room, I saw the light creeping over to what looked like a small child, but it was shaped differently. It was hairless, had a massive head, and its arms appeared to be longer than its legs. I imagine when it walked, its arms must have dragged behind him or whatever. It was very, very skinny, and it was crouched over on its knees just looking at the floor. My eyes adjusted to what I was actually seeing, and the fear and the dread washed over me. I grabbed my revolver that I left on the bedstand in one quick move and shakily pointed it at this being. My wife quickly turned on the bedstand light. It started to lift its head up to me and had the biggest, blackest eyes I've ever seen. It only had a slit for a mouth, and it didn't have any ears at all. It still got its hands over its knees but is now staring straight at me, and for a second I was transfixed to staring into those eyes. I honestly felt that it was scanning me or searching me with them. It got up, and it must have been around the height to come to my hip. It's still staring at me, and I swear to you there was a very bright flash and the thing was gone. I don't know where it went or how it managed to get through two double-locked doors. Where was the light? What even was the light? Where did the thing go? I can't explain it, but after the light, there wasn't anything but my wife and me. I searched the dresser in case it may have jumped in there, but nothing. I quickly grabbed my wife, and we frantically went over to the neighbor's house. Banging on the door, my neighbor, that I've only met twice, came to the door, saying, "Do you know what time it is? Oh shit. Come inside." He says he must have known something had happened for us to be running over there in the middle of the night. We're now in his kitchen, and I broke down in tears. I explained everything and how I failed at protecting my wife. I stressed my concern and confusion as to what this thing is or how it managed to get in and even out. My neighbor opened the whiskey bottle and said that we could stay there for the rest of the night. He and I sat up talking while my wife curled up next to me on the sofa. She didn't want to go anywhere without me or have her out of my sight. The next morning, the three of us went back to our house and thoroughly searched the place. I immediately took the hallway. We didn't find a single trace of a break-in. Everything was where it was left, and nothing was out of place. Explanations to what I saw? Tall alien, being spotted in the woods in Washington state. I was homeless from 1998 to 2004. I lived in the woods in several different areas of Washington state. I was a Boy Scout when I was younger, and my father showed me how to live off the land. I was one of the only people I knew at the time who actually had a real camp. I wasn't one of those sleeping bag in a ditch on the side of the road homeless people. I know how to start a fire in the dead of winter when everything is covered in snow. I've seen many strange things over the years, but this one event always stuck with me. This stuff happened in 1999. The first incident occurred in June. I was camping in some woods about 2 miles out of town in Everett, Washington. I had 2 friends who also camped with me. Greg and Jim. Greg was into a lot of the same things I liked, and we talked all the time about the paranormal and UFOs. Greg decided to walk to the grocery store to get snacks, so he missed what happened. It was around 5 p.m., and me and Jim were just hanging out at camp enjoying a beer. I was sitting in my tent, and Jim was standing to the left. Jim spotted something and started pointing outside the woods, where there was a clearing. I couldn't see it from where I was, so I got out and stood looking where he was pointing. There in the clearing hovered what I could only describe as an illuminated diamond. It was shaped just like the ones you see in jewelry store ads in magazines. It pulsated colored light that changed from red to yellow to fiery orange. It made no sound. It had no visible propulsion. I saw no windows or landing gear. It didn't look metallic. I would say it kind of looked like glass because I don't know how else to describe its appearance. I sat hovering over the ground, about 30 feet in the air. Not too long after I saw it and realized what it must have been, 3 black unmarked helicopters flew over the tree we were under. They came out of nowhere. We didn't hear them until they were right on top of us. They looked like Hughes D-500 helicopters. They were flying side by side. The one in the middle turned on some kind of light that was under the cockpit, and they started circling around the UFO. I would say they did this 4 to 5 times before turning around and flying back over us and leaving. Jim kept saying, "This can't be real and it's a UFO." Over and over again. I think what we saw shattered his reality. This guy didn't believe in UFOs or aliens at all. He was the type who made fun of others who said they believed in this sort of thing. The object started to move slowly. It moved to the right in a straight line, and then it changed direction and moved to the left in a straight line. It did this, I think maybe 3 times, and then it vanished into a golden streak of light. The temperature in the woods dropped all of a sudden, and our teeth started chattering. Jim grabbed his pack and booked. I stayed, and when Greg came back, I told him what we saw. He became excited and exclaimed, "Oh man. I wish I could have been here to see it." I stayed in that spot for a couple days more and then decided to move my camp further into the woods. For some reason, seeing that UFO didn't affect me the way it did Jim. He was hiding out somewhere, and no one could find him. When you did run into the guy, he would make a lame excuse for having to leave, and he'd be gone. He did this to me and Greg several times until one day we never saw him again. Flash forward to August. I was camping alone. Greg was living at his girlfriend's apartment. I had just gotten back to my camp from walking to town to get a shower and something to eat. I was wide awake. It was starting to get dark, but there was just enough light to see through the trees. My camp sat near the edge of the woods next to a guy's house. The gentleman whose house I was near owned a dog. I know this because I cut through his backyard one night and the dog barked at me. I was sitting in my tent with the front window unzipped, reading a book by flashlight. I've always had very good hearing. I could hear what sounded like someone trying to creep up to my camp down a path I had blazed. I figured it was probably a neighbor kid or someone trying to spook me. I could hear what sounded like fabric rubbing together like pant legs from someone walking toward me. I turned off my flashlight and sat silently waiting for them to get closer. They got up to where my camp was, and they just stopped moving. I waited for them to move, staring out the tent window, trying to spot whoever it was. I guess the plan was to jump out of my tent and catch them in the act so they would run off scared. That's not exactly what happened, to put it lightly. What I saw that night was the most frightening thing I've ever seen. It was the silhouette of a 10 to 12 foot tall thin being. It had a thin neck with a large bulbous head. There didn't appear to be any hair on its head. It hunched forward as it walked. Its arms were so long that its hands hung below where a person's knees would be. It walked in big strides. It made no noise as it moved. It went from the right side of my camp to the left. I was freaked out. I remember thinking, what the hell? I got out of my tent and shined my flashlight around, trying to spot it. It was nowhere to be seen. I guess I must have gone into what they call fight or flight mode because I was ready to fight off whatever it was. But it simply disappeared. The woods were dead silent. I couldn't even hear crickets. The neighbor's dog wasn't barking, which I found odd. I knew I saw something, but it appeared to have left. I got back into my tent and shrugged it off. I'm not sure why I did this, but I went back to reading my book, but I could not concentrate on the words. I became tired all of a sudden, as if I had been put under a sleeping spell. I couldn't keep my eyes open, no matter how hard I fought it. I laid down and put my flashlight and my pocket knife next to me and closed my eyes. I told myself, I'll just lay here and listen. I ended up passing out, but before I did, I heard what sounded like little people rushing toward my tent from all four corners. I woke up the next morning feeling like I had the best night's sleep in my life. I can't explain it. I moved my camp not too long after this had happened. As I gave what happened to me more thought, it dawned on me what must have occurred. I believe I was abducted. I don't have any memories of being taken on board a ship or anything. It's just what makes sense, I guess. This event frightened me so bad that for years I was afraid to be alone. Especially during the night. I lock all my doors and windows before I go to bed. I don't like it when I am in the shower washing my hair and I have to close my eyes. I get a sense of dread and anticipation. I feel like I'm going to get snatched when I'm not paying attention. I've suffered with insomnia for years. It's gotten better now, but I used to only get like 3 hours of sleep per night. Sometimes I hear what sounds like movement at night, and I just lay in bed listening. Usually nothing happens, but sometimes I see shadow people. I don't know what happened to me that night in the woods or what that thing was I saw. But I know it wasn't a human, and it sure as hell wasn't an animal, and I will never forget it. Aliens are real. I've seen one. This story actually takes place not too long ago, early October of this year, 2020, if anyone's reading this in the future. I was on a vacation to California with my mom, and we were going to visit one of her friends, who just so happens to also be an empath. I was actually really excited because, where I'm from, people like me aren't exactly common. I've never actually met someone outside of psychic shops who's seen what I had, and hearing that this lady has, I was bouncing on my heels in anticipation to meet her. I go to her house, and we talk for a little while. Me being the introvert I am, I mostly just listen to their conversation in amusement and observe her aura so I can get a good sense of who she is as a person. I have trust issues, so I like to observe people. She soon offers we take a walk around her neighborhood, which I very quickly agree to do. I put on my shoes and basically skipped outside, because let me just tell you, it was absolutely beautiful. It was October 1st, so the moon was full. Contrary to most psychics, my energy is actually restored in full moons, but most people talk about how their energy is drained on full moons. We're walking around, having a nice time outside, and my senses are just completely expanded. My hearing is better, my eyesight is better, and I was actually a little freaked out at hearing all of the animals scurrying in the bushes who were oh so very obviously following us. It was very beautiful. Secluded, literally no people, a delicate, gentle, cool breeze. I love winds, they're like a hug from the universe. Eventually, we have to go back to the house, and this is where shit starts to get weird. So my little psychic alarm sense starts going off. Very faintly, like, it was telling me something was there, but we weren't in danger. I'm a very anxious person, so I simply ignored it, but then I turned around and I saw a person walk by. It was very quick, very brief, and me, being curious as I am, I started looking around the area where I saw the figure. My mom and her friend noticed this and asked me what I'm doing. And I turn to them and say, "Who's your boyfriend?" Or, not that I'm assuming you two are a couple, just, who was that person? And they both give me a creeped out look, and I feel enticed to explain. Well, I just saw someone walk by. He was very tall, and then I began to remember the physical details about him and realized they weren't like humans. He was about 5'10", maybe 6'0" tall, and was completely gray. Almost like a dolphin gray? He was naked. You could make out details, but it was nothing grotesque. He didn't have genitals or anything. Actually, he didn't have facial features. Or hair. I described this to them, and they turned pale and started looking around the house to see if someone had broken in, but no one was there. My mom looked at me like I was crazy. Nothing new. And I began to theorize that maybe the creature I saw was a demon. Because the only time I've ever seen a spiritual being physically manifest itself into a thing on the physical plane, it was a demon. But the other empath explained to me that maybe I saw an alien. She explained it to me in a jokey manner, but it all clicked, and my intuition told me she was right. And I'm sure now that I saw an alien in her home. My only question is, why was it there? I was 9. It was Christmas Eve, 1988, and my family's Christmas Eve party was winding down. My grandma was digging through the remnants of boxes, bows, and wrapping papers from our family's white elephant gift exchange to see what she could salvage for next year, and my mother and aunt were laughing and trading stories of holidays past. My two older half-sisters, Sherry and Penny, who were adults at the time, being 18 and 20 years older than me, were picking over the leftovers on the dining room table. I was sitting near the back of the Christmas tree, where 3 gifts with my name on them remained. These were from my mom and grandma, and as it was tradition that I could open only 1 gift before bedtime on Christmas Eve, the rest I had to wait and open with my Santa gifts on Christmas morning. I assessed the 3 packages for some time before making my selection. It was nearing midnight, I had to be in bed soon, so I decided to just pick the biggest because it had weight and didn't sound like clothes when I shook it. When my mom said it was time, I eagerly unwrapped the gift. At my grandma's unspoken request, I was careful not to rip the paper or mess up the bow and set them aside as my gift was revealed. It was a telescope. It wasn't a high-quality count the rings of Saturn type though. It was small, mostly made of plastic, and still had the $14.99 price sticker on the box. I was gracious, though I was not impressed, not because of the quality. I didn't know the difference between a nice telescope and a cheap toy one because I simply had no interest in its function, and even if I was interested in what it did, the simple assembly required to make it work exceeded the grasp of my exceptionally short attention span. Now, my sister Sherry is the oldest, and to me back then, she was like a bossy hall monitor. She had no real authority, but that didn't stop her from trying to run everything. I'm 41 now, and she is 61, and seriously, not much has changed in that aspect. My other sister Penny is just 2 years younger than Sherry, so she would have been 29 at the time. She was different. A combination of unattended schizophrenia and drug abuse made her the wild card, meaning you never knew what you were going to get with her. On this night she had managed to maintain a level of normalcy and a jovial mood, though under any circumstance at that time and regardless of her behavior, her personality seemed more comparable to mine rather than to any of the adults in the room. Penny took an enthusiastic interest in my new gift and asked if we could go out back and test it out. I agreed, knowing that my compliance would afford me a bit more time before I had to go to bed, and being a child on the night before Christmas, I was naturally restless. Penny and I ascended onto the back porch, and in no time at all, my sister had the telescope assembled and in position for celestial exploration. It took her a bit longer to find a point of focus and adjust all the little knobs for optimal viewing, so while she was occupied with that, my attention was drawn to the icicles that had formed on the awning and the dog's water bowl that had turned to solid ice. Being a Texan, this isn't generally common, even for December. Though it isn't generally uncommon. Our winters are short, and much like my eccentric sister, you never know what you're going to get when it arrives. I feel the need to preface this next part of the story with 2 very important points. First, I need to say that my memory of this incident, however perplexing, is as clear and as vivid to me now as the very night it occurred, so this is a true and accurate account. Secondly, this entire event lasted no more than a minute, and while I must describe these events in succession, many of them occurred all at once. I had just taken off my mittens so I could utilize the full function of my hands and fingers for grasping when I heard Penny exclaim in amusement, "Whoa, cool." Still having no interest at all in stargazing and far more focused on trying to retrieve the perfect icicle from the awning using a garden hoe, I didn't even look up from what I was doing, figuring she had managed to find something bright to look at, and that just meant I had a bit more time to spend on trying to dislodge the big, beautiful icicle before it melted. Then, it occurred to me that the icicle was definitely melting and quite rapidly, just moments before it was still in the process of forming. Now it's dripping like a leaky faucet, and what was even stranger was that all this water was dripping around me yet it made no sound. In fact, nothing made a sound, not the water or the wind or the highway in the distance, not even my sister tinkering with that telescope. Then the dripping slowed, and I don't mean that in the sense that there was more time between each drop, but rather the droplets were taking longer to fall to the ground. Confused, I immediately looked over at my sister and found her standing upright, not bent over, peering into the telescope, but staring out into the yard. I turned to match her gaze, and what I saw completely eluded the grasp of my 9-year-old comprehension. Hovering a mere 4 feet above my backyard fence was an almond-shaped capsule about the size of a pontoon boat. It was a metallic color like chrome with no discernible crevasses, no windows, no doors. It was completely flush, and even though it had no fixtures for light to shine from, the area around it was entirely illuminated as light reflected off of millions of water droplets now suspended in mid-air. I was struck with fear and confusion as I broke my gaze just long enough to look over at my sister, searching for some sort of sign as to what this thing was and if we were in any danger. Penny looked over at me, grinning from ear to ear. "Cindy boo, it's a UFO." I didn't hear her say it, and her lips didn't move, but that's what she said. We both looked back at the object, and it tilted slightly downward. At this angle it appeared to be spinning as a flash of iridescent lights made one complete rotation around its exterior, then in a split second it shot straight up and disappeared into the night sky. Darkness resumed along with all the sounds of the night and the crisp chill of the air. I stood dumbfounded, amazed, and terrified by what I'd just experienced, while at the same time, I felt relief that it was over and excited. I didn't know whether to run away, cry, or laugh. I looked over at my sister, wanting to run to her but still frozen to the place I stood, as if all of my cognitive resources were occupied, trying to process everything, and I was momentarily unable to communicate movement to my legs. Penny was clearly not frightened by what we had just witnessed. She seemed just as blissful as I'd ever seen her, and while at times I found that refreshing, in this instance, it confused me. I needed to observe a regular adult response. Reclaiming the use of my legs, I ran towards the door, saying, "Let's go tell Mom." "Yeah," Penny agreed and followed me through the back door. I was glad she was there and had my back. I knew there was no way my mom would believe just me about a spaceship if it had been only me, running in with my Kmart telescope. We entered the dining room, where Mom stood laughing as my grandma sang the phrase, "We won't go until we get some." "Mom." Me and Penny just saw a. I briefly forgot what my sister had called it, but she chimed in to assist. "A UFO." Penny injected. "You did? With your new telescope?" Mom inquired. "No, it was in the backyard by my fort, right above the fence, and..." I wanted to tell her everything all at once, but I just wasn't fast or articulate enough to express what all had transpired, and my mom was a regular adult who saw me as an imaginative child and my sister as, well, as a somewhat mild version of the crazy person she expected to show by the end of the night. "Maybe it was Santa. I hope he doesn't pass you up because you're not in bed." I didn't believe in Santa Claus. I never did. I just pretended for as long as I could for the extra presents. I did understand the situation I was in, though. I knew Mom was done for the night and wanted me to go to bed so she could set up the Santa gifts and finally get some rest herself. Not to mention, she was usually well within the bounds of good insight by steering away from conversations featuring supernatural events with my sister. It just so happened that on this occasion, it was all true, and I understood that she would never know that. Shortly after that, a movie came out called Fire in the Sky, starring D.B. Sweeney, a based on true events film about a small-town man who was allegedly abducted by aliens, experimented on, and returned several days later. The movie, coupled with my memory of that event, terrified me beyond expression, causing me to have night terrors throughout my childhood about the visitors returning to claim me, and I'm certain it initiated my lifelong battle with sleep paralysis dreams. I was so terrified, I wouldn't watch or read anything that had to do with extraterrestrials, and I wouldn't speak of it again for nearly 30 years. Somewhere in that span of time, I convinced myself that the entire event had been a terrible nightmare that I happened to just remember every single detail of, down to the mittens I was wearing, where they landed on the ground when I took them off, and the rush of heat I felt, hot on my cheeks from the fireplace, when I ran back into the house that night. My sister was estranged for many years throughout my childhood, as her condition got much worse before it began to get better. She finally got clean and got on the right medications, and a few years ago, she came to live with us. The first week she was here, we spent a lot of time talking about different things that had happened over the years, things she'd said and done. I discovered that she had barely any recollection of a great deal of it, claiming that must have been the other me. I guess I got caught up in the spirit of sharing, or I got brave or something, but I decided to ask her about that night during one of our talks. "Do you remember that one Christmas Eve?" is all I got out of my mouth before she responded with, "You mean the night we saw that UFO in the backyard?" That's a memory that stuck. I remember it as clear as yesterday. She then proceeded to describe the experience from her perspective with very little variation from my own experience. So, there it is. It was not a dream. It was not my 9-year-old imagination. All those little details that made no sense, the ones I used to tell myself it didn't happen, are the same details that later on affirmed the reality of it. I saw a UFO in my backyard on Christmas Eve, 1988. I was 9 years old.